That song is Debbie Friedman, of course. There she goes again. And it is both an amazing and a terrible song. It just absolutely both things at once. I don't know what else to say about it, but I play it pointedly this morning. The Zichrona Livracha, she really gave a lot to us, Debbie Friedman. I play it this morning because it is a twist, obviously, just, a little but obvious twist on a famous...
share my screen first, and then...
Jess, who is that? I think that's you, Jess, if you can turn your sound off.
Zoom is new. They have updates, so we're figuring it out. Very sorry.
Okay. Right, Lech Lecha. It's a play on Lech Lecha, the great command, message, moment of prophecy, beginning of our tradition, which is spoken by God to Abraham. And all Debbie Friedman is doing is singing it also in the feminine, right? The command form, masculine would be lech, and feminine would be lechi, lechi lach. So that's the command should be issued unto women as well. That little twist should suggest that universal command which we all own. Since we all own it, we should think of it in both ways. And that feels like a modern kind of feminist approach, reading, twist, right? Informed by the insights of our generations, of Debbie's generation. But what I want to do today is to really make the case that that's what Debbie Friedman's done there is not just a modern twist, but that actually it taps into something deep that's going on in the Torah's own narrative. And now I'm just going to repeat something that I've said a number of times before, but today really want to try to prove it, if you will, which is that we sometimes speak of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then if we are egalitarian in our sensibilities, we also mention the matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, right? I mentioned them all. But really, the triad is neither of those things, but Abraham, Rebecca, and Jacob. Rebecca is really the dominant figure in this generation. Our Parsha this week begins, Ele Toldot Yitzchak. These are the generations of Isaac. And that follows the form, the patriarchal form. He's the head of the house. I mean, patriarchal in the most technical way. It follows the form, but we'll soon see that Isaac is not, and most of you know this in some ways intuitively, just by looking through the story, that Isaac is not the dominant figure in this generation. And it isn't just, it is, so I think many of us have probably noticed Rebecca is a powerful force and figure. But I want to say that this week even stronger and say, no, she is actually, Debbie Friedman is right. She's actually like the one who is carrying the covenant into the next generation. Okay, so that's our work for today. Let's begin with a blessing. And you shall be a blessing. We'll begin with a blessing over the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, let's see here. I want to give you, so basically, we're going to head right into Parshat Toldot, this week's Parsha, which is, and I had this conversation with Julia Berg, who's in the class today, which is maybe my favorite Parsha. And I exclaimed with delight last time I spoke to Julia, because she said that before I did. She said, well, this is my favorite Parsha. I said, oh my gosh, this is my favorite Parsha. Like, it was like great, like loving the same band or something. So it really is a total masterpiece. From start to finish, the writing is superb. The construction is ornate, elaborate. It touches on some of the core themes of the Torah. And Rebecca will play a huge, maybe the huge role in this week's Parsha, even though it's the generations of Isaac. It's Rebecca who will do the things, just like in the last generation. Sure, it was Abraham and Sarah, but it was Abraham. He's the one that did most of the things. Right? Sarah's pretty powerful, actually. Sarah, I would say, is more powerful than Isaac is with respect to the really dominant force, Abraham and then Rebecca. But anyway, Rebecca will play a huge role in this week's Parsha. But let's also remember that Rebecca is essentially the star of last week's Parsha as well. And we don't usually think of it that way. The Parsha is called Chaye Sarah, the lives of Sarah, but it begins with Sarah's death. Right? So it's like, that's interesting. It's like an allusion to the matriarch, but it's actually not about her, but actually is about the birth of this new matriarch, the rise of this new matriarch. And I say the rise, I've called this class the rise of the matriarchy, and Emma, who posted it for me, says, this sounds a little like Star Wars. And it is a little like that. The going and the finding of Rebecca in last week's Parsha feels a little bit like Luke Skywalker. It's like, but actually, right, like the new Star Wars, right, where the star again of this generation is his daughter, right? So because we live in a patriarchal tradition and are used to speaking of things in this way, we'll even talk about that story as the story of Abraham going to get a wife for his son. Right? That's the way you've heard of that story described. That's the story. And it's Abraham's servant going and on Abraham's servant's journey. And it's true, it's framed in that way. Because that's the classic framing, always through the eyes of the men. But it is about Rebecca and what's great about Rebecca and what's special about Rebecca. And we see, and here we begin to head in, we see even back in that Parsha, Rebecca is different than any of the women figures that we've met before this. Right? Sarah definitely had dominance, and Hagar has her own power. I mean, the Torah, I guess I want to say along the way, is not, it's a patriarchal document. It's not a misogynistic document, I don't think, or at least it's not interested in, let's put it smaller. It's not interested in ignoring women. Right? Women play, but Rebecca's different. And Rebecca, I want to claim, is the first really fierce controller of a generation, first woman to really be the dominant force in a generation. And we see that, okay, so here I'm going to give you this source sheet. We see that there's a lot to say, and we can't tell her whole story today, but because after all, the finding of Rebecca was like her passing a test that showed that she was especially righteous and she did exactly the right thing and she fed the camels. And the word for camel is an allusion to a good deed, gmalim, right? So there's something about her that are like, there's something special we feel already. But the moment to me where Rebecca really kind of breaks through in a surprising way from really any kind of usual pass through Torah narrative is in this moment. Oh, Jess, I'm going to need to have screen sharing capacity. Great, thank you. In this moment here, so let's begin. Okay. So they're talking about, like, what I want to continue to say is this is a patriarchy. She lives in a patriarchy. There's no question the Torah writes from the patriarchal tradition, and yet Rebecca is bursting through in a way that I think pretty explicitly punctures that framing. Because here the servant is talking with Rebecca's family, and they say, let us call the girl and ask for her reply. She's young. I don't know. You get the impression that she is a teenager, or, you know, she's fetching water, young 20. She's like the girl of the house. They called her Rebecca and they said to her, will you go with this man? That's interesting. I mean, that's just what I mean to say that this is not she has no choice at all. It's interesting to note, okay, consent does seem to be part of this conversation. But what's I think really significant here is that she responds in one word. There's no, she just says elech, elech. Now, what are we to make of that? What do we make of that exchange where they ask her if she wants to go, and what she says is elech, I will go. What do we hear in there? This is a little bit of a pop quiz, right? It's not like, I'm not asking you to interpret, I'm asking you to identify. There's a connection there. There's a connection.
And you will be up.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Exactly. That will you go forth and become a part of this covenantal family that began one generation ago with Lech Lecha, Elech, I will go. Right? That echo is there, and if you don't believe me, because after all, it's just the verb to go, right? You might say, whoa, that's a little bit of a stretch. I'm not sure I'm in. Take a look at the next line, and then we'll look at Rashi, what Rashi does for us, and Rashi will help us a lot along the way here. Okay, so let's take a look. The next line is, so they sent off their sister Rebecca and her nursemaid, I guess, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebecca, right? Vayvarachu et Rivka, it's Rivka in the Hebrew, vayomru la achotenu, at hayi la'alfei revava, v'yirash zarech et shar sonav. They blessed Rebecca and they said to her, oh sister, may you grow into myriad thousands. May your offspring seize the gates of your enemies. Now, let's just like take stock of that. Let's just admit that that's very spirited language. I mean, they're saying goodbye to their sister. Okay, that's a big deal, but there's something kind of epic about the scale of this. May you grow into myriad thousands. May your offspring seize the gates of their enemies. Their enemies? Right? Like, oh, now she's like fighting wars and okay, but what does this remind us of? And I'm not going to click back because, again, it's a little bit rhetorical. You know where I'm headed with. But what does this language remind us of? Well, if we didn't hear the echo already, take a look at what Rashi helps us see. May you grow into myriad thousands. Rashi says, may you and your seed receive a blessing that was promised to Abraham on Mount Moriah. Direct connection to Abraham. Et zarech tekablu ota bracha shenemar le'Avram b'har Moriah. And what's the blessing there in Genesis 22:17? I will greatly multiply thy seed. And actually, Rashi just says, etc. But the verse ends, and let thy seed possess the gates of their enemies. It's like the same language here. Harbe arbe, revava, zarecha, your seed. And then even here, I actually wanted you to see this. So take a look. Ooh, it's in the. Take a look at this. Just for those of you who care about really tracking the words here, because I do think that's an important method of analysis. You can see here, right? Inherit your ancestors the gates of their enemies. And what was the language for Rebecca? Inherit your seed the gates of their haters, right? So I hope that you are convinced that there's something happening here with Rebecca where she is entering into the Abrahamic covenant. She is becoming the one. Now, maybe that's just, I'm setting this all up so we begin to analyze the first few lines of Toldot, which we'll do together. But this is all a setup because I'm anticipating your response, and your response might be, well, she's given this lofty language because she's going to be the queen of the next generation. Great, she's going to be the queen. There will be a king, though. None of this, great, there's an echo of Abraham, she's coming into the covenant of Abraham. Like, I'm arguing against myself now and saying, maybe it isn't that big a deal. She's just going to be the next matriarch, which is number 2 to the patriarch. Okay? So, with that in mind, can you hear my garbage trucks outside? With that in mind, let's go now into Parsha Toldot itself and begin to see, just in the first few lines, my goodness, this Parsha is so thick, so rich. It's a shame and a crime not to study any of it. Why aren't we studying the stealing of the blessing? Why aren't we studying the purchase of the birthright? We will actually touch on all those things and through the story of Rebecca. But I just want us to take a look, especially at this first moment where the story of Isaac. Right, this is the way it begins. Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Okay, this is the story of Isaac. This is the generations of Isaac. But what's the most important thing about the generations of Isaac? First of all, that he was Abraham's son. That's what's important. And secondly, that he is Rebecca's husband. Right? Vayi Yitzchak ben Avram shana. Ben 40 shana bekachtot Rivka bat Betuel Arami mipadan Aram achot Laban Arami lo lisha. Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebecca, daughter of Betuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of the Laban the Aramean. Okay, and this is the last thing I'm just going to speak out for us. I'll begin to open the conversation a little bit, but I want to say there also, that's quite an announcement of Rebecca there. Not only is Rebecca the first significant thing that Isaac is said to have done in his life, other than being offered up on an altar, but she is the daughter of Betuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of and again, that's patriarchal language. She's a daughter, she's a sister. It's true, but on the other hand, it's quite an announcement. Okay, all right. Now let's actually get into the story. Okay. And these lines, we'll spend most of our time on these lines, and they have just been some of my favorite lines in the whole Torah. One phrase in particular that comes from our matriarch Rebecca is the one that is most perplexing and most available for our interpretation. So let's read it together. Vayatar Yitzchak laHashem לנוכח אשתו, כי יקרה היא. ויתר לו השם ותהה רבקה אשתו. ויתרוצצו הבנים בקרבה, ותאמר אם כן, למה זה אנוכי? ותלך לדרוש את השם. Isaac pleaded with the Eternal on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Eternal responded to his plea, and his wife Rebecca conceived. Wow, that worked. But the children struggled in her womb. As we'll soon see, this language could it be like they ran around inside of her? This is the word here. Vayitrotzatsu abanim b'kirba. And she said, if this is the language that I want us to spend our time analyzing. Im ken lama ze anochi. Very, very difficult to understand exactly what she's saying there. I'm just translating it literally. If so, why is this me? But I don't know. We could translate it differently. If yes, why this I? And she went to seek answers from the Eternal. And that may sound like a weird translation. She went to seek answers. But the word here is lidrosh. And it's a very unusual word. Right? We don't see it come up that often. And it's not the word that Isaac used. Isaac entreated, right? V'yatar. Isaac prayed, beseeched God. But she went, this word is to seek. So to seek answers, to seek out, to seek. She went seeking. In fact, we call the rabbinic mode of interpretation, the rabbinic mode of interpretation, midrash, seeking answers. Okay. That was a lot of setup, but I wanted to give us a real framework here. But now we're going to go from the macro to the micro and just ask the question, the Parshanut question here. And we're going to start to look at the commentators. What is she saying there? And what is she doing there? The children ran around inside of her, right? And she said, "Im ken lama ze anochi?" If so, why this me? Why am I this way? And she went to seek answers from God. So let's start there. People may have other thoughts based on the insane amount of rambling I did up front, but let's start there. Im ken lama ze anochi? Yonatan, let's start with you.
So, first of all, I want to thank you for walking us through this angle, because for the first time in my life, I read this really differently from how I've always seen it. It seems if Isaac is the one doing the beseeching, she's not beseeching, she's infertile, and she may be perfectly happy with that. And he's petitioning God for her to become pregnant, and she becomes pregnant, and she's very pregnant. She's got twins, they're running around, and maybe she's going, what's going on? Like, if he wants me to get pregnant and I don't want to, that's the deal I get? Like, what does this mean about me, my agency, my humanity?
I love
Who am I
that.
in this story?
Love that, because you're doing a brilliant job of something I'm also trying to do, which is not to fall into the assumptions of the patriarchal tradition. And one of them is she definitely wants to get pregnant. What do you mean? Right? Like you just assume that in the story, and I think that's a really keen reading and really strong possibility. Maybe she's not interested, and all of a sudden this is happening to her. Isaac pleaded, and that I want us to keep an eye on that, because that'll become relevant in some of the commentaries. Okay, Leah.
Hey, so I read it as like, just like, why is this happening to me? But also in the sense of like this feeling of unrest in her own body, like what's happening here, what's going to happen. I feel it's like a violence like going on in my body. What's going to happen? What's going to come from this kind of?
Yeah. And Leah, do you mean in that sense, she's just like pregnancy? This is a reflection, a woman's reflection on pregnancy, or do you think that they're saying she's having an unusual pregnancy? Or which do you mean?
I mean, like unusual, like maybe she's not had it before, but she just feels like off to her somehow. What's happening in my body with this?
Good. Yeah. And of course, there will be twins soon, so there will be reason for that.
Like what's gonna happen now? Like I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's gonna happen.
She may not know. She may not know.
Yeah.
Great, Joni. Unmute.
Most women pregnant go to other women and ask them, have you experienced anything like this? I'm really feeling all of this. And Rebecca has a sense of access to God because she says, I'm going to the eternal. So that really jumped out at me. Yeah.
Great. That comment will reappear later when we see the Ibn Ezra, but just want to underline the last thing he said. What a powerful, and she went to seek God. That, you could just read it that way, or however you read it. I'm going to go talk to God about this. Whoa. Payam.
I mean, for me, I think she saw herself, the part is the strife inside of her. And I think that's her question, like, why am I the seed, or why is the strife in me? Like, I almost see like she had a destiny and she like accepted her destiny, I will. And like, that was supposed to be like this peaceful thing, which gives rise to the next generation of like peace. And then like inside of her, these two people like fighting. And I think like that scares her. Like, why am I the source of this strife? So that's why she goes to God.
Very lovely reading, Payam. Very, very lovely reading. Payam connects it back to that first scene that we opened with, a mention of her seed, right? She's going to, so it seems like she's entering into this exciting covenant. She's going to, give birth. It's going to be great. Why would it be a conflict, right? Beautiful reading there, beautiful. Let's hear from one more voice, and then I want to plow in a little bit. Yes, Matt, it's going to be you.
Maybe she's not talking about the pregnancy. Lots and lots and lots of people talk to God. God almost never responds. Isaac talked to God. She gets pregnant. Maybe she's saying, hey, why did you do something to me? Not forget that it's pregnancy, and is going to talk to God because God has done. It's the direction that she is, in fact, connected to God. It's not the pregnancy. It's, hey, you've done this. What's going on here? Why'd you pick me?
Good. So this is a much larger declaration. Wait a minute. What? All of this is happening. Why me? Why me? Why'd you pick me? What is my destiny? how do I fit into all of this, right? And is it just that I'm the vehicle for this thing and happening inside? What is going on? Love that, reading that, love that. Okay, with that sort of big picture, let's start to take a look now at what the commentators themselves say. And if we are lucky today, we're gonna get to, oh, I don't know, maybe my favorite piece of Torah commentary ever. Maybe just might. So let's move into it. We're gonna take a look, we'll lean, as we often do, on the greatest of the commentators, Rashi. And Rashi will bring us to the most famous midrash, the most famous rabbinic, by rabbinic I mean early centuries, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, most famous rabbinic midrash. That's what Rashi does. He brings in earlier traditions of interpretation, and this one is a classic. Now Rashi is going to start with the phrase, the children rumbling inside of her, the children struggling inside of her. And let's just take a look at that, at what he says there. He's going to seed us with this midrash, and it'll be useful to us for our later interpretations. And notice that he begins by saying, Hamikra ze omer darsheni. Sometimes he says this, occasionally he says it, and it's like Rashi is really like saying, whoa, this is a crazy verse, right? This verse says, interpret me, darsheni. By the way, same language that Rebecca goes to seek God. You notice that? Rebecca goes to seek God. This verse says, seek after me, interpret me. Now we're in the same process that Rebecca is in, right? Because it doesn't really explain what was this struggling about, right? V'katav, and then suddenly it says, if so, why me? So what do you mean? If what? What's going on? What is that? Okay, so Rashi says, our rabbis interpreted the word vayitrotzatzu to mean running, ritzah. Here it is in Hebrew, lashon ritzah. For whenever she passed by the doors of the Torah, what does that mean? I.e. the schools of Shem and Ever. There's a legend that one of Noah's sons started a yeshiva. It's a great legend. But whenever she would pass by the Pitchei Torah, the doors of Torah, Shel Shem Ve'ever, Jacob ran and tried to get out. Okay, she's like walking and she's got these two twins, and Jacob's like, whoa, Torah, I want some of that, and tries to just run right out of her stomach, right? Like babies kick, you know? So like, but now here's the story, like he wants that Torah, gotta get out now. But whenever she passed by a door of idol worship, Esau ran and tried to get out. I want to be a pagan. I want to do idol worship, right? These little babies already drawn, right? Okay, this is the famous midrash, but Rashi adds another possibility, and I want to give that to you as well, because sometimes when Rashi gives us one answer and then says, here's another answer, it's a clue that there's something insufficient. Like, so he's given us one piece of one image, which is that these two children are sort of like heading towards idolatry or heading towards Torah. And then he says, another explanation is that it means struggle. It doesn't mean running, it means struggle, because they struggled with one another in there and fought over how they should divide the two worlds as their inheritance. The two worlds is both a reference to Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, the world to come in this world, but also I think just they fought over how would they divide the world, right? The two children, Jacob and Esau, right? Who will both become the heads of these great nations. Okay, so this is a little bit of a pause. We're taking a pause here because I want to flesh this midrashic interpretation out, because as Rebecca reflects on like what's going on inside of her, Rashi imagines that part of what she's reflecting on is the two children and their very different tendencies. So what's going on? What's going on inside of her? What do the rabbis want us to understand is vayitzrotetsu, is contending inside of her? Anyone willing to take that up, Alexandra?
I think it ties into what you were saying earlier about the blessings she received, that her children will vanquish their enemies, and why this became for her to me, the way I read it is that she's equating this struggle with her identity. And you can equate a struggle with your identity, or you can just say it's an experience I'm having, but that's not who I am. And she's saying this is who I am. And it makes me think that she received this blessing that her children would vanquish their enemies, but they're vanquishing each other, and that's a curse. And so who is she? She's seeking her identity, which I also think is a more elevated question than the way Yitzchak was approaching God. And she was like seeking her identity. If I have this connection to God and yet I receive this curse, like who am I? Who is God even? And what is our relationship? And and I think that's how God works, through the principle of economy. Like the curses and the blessings are so intertwined, and you have to parse them out as you're seeking identity. And who she was elevated Yitzchak, I think, through her.
Okay, great. So Rebecca, I love what you're saying. Rebecca is reflecting on, like, these children is a way of reflecting on herself. What am I birthing into the world? What is to be my legacy? Because I thought it was going to be thousands vanquishing foes. I love what you said there. They're going to vanquish their foes, but wait, they're vanquishing each other in there. Like, what's going on? Aren't I the mother of myriad thousands? This seems like the problem is between these children, right? And they're contending. So that's troubling. Right? And you're building on a strain of interpretation that Payam started for us, that Matt started building up, that she's somehow aware of something special, some great destiny that's being placed upon her, and she's just saying, wait, but it seems like it's already messy. It's already like breaking apart inside, right? And your language at the end there is very striking. I mean, she wants now to have a relationship with God. What is my relationship with God? I've got to figure. Okay, a lot of what Alexandra said, actually, when I said we're going to see one of my favorite pieces of Torah commentary, Alexandra's anticipating a lot of that. So keep those thoughts in mind. All right, let's take one more thought before we see more commentary. And I see that Kathy has a hand up in one black box, but she actually exists in another box with Hal.
Right. So yeah, just to throw you off. So I was wondering, I guess this is really more of a question, but whether any of this is supposed to refer back to the Garden of Eden, and the expulsion from the garden, because part of that expulsion is pain and childbirth. And I don't know if that's supposed to evoke some of that at all. And, I guess, well, just one other point, I guess, is a sort of a side point too, is that I was really struck at the beginning about Isaac pleading with God on behalf of Rebecca because she was barren. And it just automatically brought to mind, sort of what's the timeline here? Like, how did they figure out that she was barren? Because usually it takes a long time to figure that out. I would imagine, that you're really taught, and that maybe she doesn't think she's barren at that point. I don't know. Anyway, I just, when you, kind of from personal experience, you don't just go, oh, I didn't get pregnant this month, I must be barren. It's a whole kind of process. And for him to come to that conclusion before she did, seems really strange to me. So something's weird is going on there too. Anyway. Wow,
Kathy, you just, as usual, so many profound things there. But I want to pick up especially on that really, really intriguing connection that you make to the curse in the opening chapters of Genesis, where as Kathy said, one of the curses that Eve receives is pain in childbirth, right? And it says there something interesting, is that you will desire your husband, right? V'hu yimshalbach, but he will rule over you. And you'll want children and you'll want your husband, but he'll rule over you. And that could be read as the Torah is now giving us gender roles. The man is in charge, but it also, I mean, it's a curse. Right? Eve receives a curse of like being attached to childbirth and to a man, and something that's not good, that he's dominating her. That's not going to be good for her. And so if Rebecca is in this same pattern of like barrenness and difficulty in labor that women in the Torah have been contending with, and Isaac is sort of like, deciding things, praying on her behalf, right? Like, and then, right, so everything you just said, and then we are going to try and track Rebecca as an overturner of that hierarchy. Then there's a way in which she's overturning something that goes all the way back, like a pattern that's been being set for women since the earliest days. And maybe Rebecca is not just the big matriarch in this gender, but it's like changing something about how women relate to their role, to their husbands, to pregnancy. Okay, let's keep going. Let's start to see a few more of these commentators, because we're going to see especially Nachmanides and the Kli Yakar are interesting here. I gave us the Rashi, who provided us with this beautiful midrash, or at least vivid midrash here. The idea of the two children, idolatry, Torah, this world, that world. But when Rashi explains the Im Kain Lama Ze Anochi, it's almost like Rashi forgets everything that, like Rashi cites all this and makes the struggle so massive. And then, but when Rashi says, and she said, if so, interprets it, if the pain of pregnancy be so great, why is this me? Then why did I desire and pray to become pregnant? Okay, like that's a good reading of the words. If so, if I am hurting, why me? Why did I want to become pregnant? That's a little flat, I would say, as a reading, given all of what Rashi was just saying is going inside of her. So, the Ramban here, Ramban is Moses Nachmanides, takes up Rashi's interpretation, and he also thinks it's a little flat. Look at how he says it. He's stronger voice than I am. And she said, if so, why is this me? The Ramban here says Ramban is a medieval commentator about 150 years after Rashi. And he's Spanish. Rashi was French. This is like 10th century, 11th century. Yeah, no, 11th century, 12th century. Rashi said, if the pain of pregnancy is so great, why did I desire and pray to become pregnant? And that is not correct. I love that. You gotta take note of this. This is the way Torah commentary works. It's like, especially the Ramban is just like, dismiss. That answer is not sufficient. Rashi, the greatest Torah commentator of all time, right? That is not correct. Then he moves on to the second greatest Torah commentator of all time, the Ibn Ezra, who we haven't seen, but Joni, I think, was describing something that similar to what the Ibn Ezra is saying here. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra says, what is she saying, Im Kain Lama Ze Anochi, why me? She was asking other women if this had happened to them. And they told her no. And so she said, well, if that's the regular way, why do I have such a strange pregnancy? Okay. But so again, the Ibn Ezra makes the assumption that Joni made that, like, usually wouldn't there be a conversation with other women about the nature of pregnancy? And so he reads that in, and this is her presumed response to these women, is his interpretation. And Nachmanides doesn't like this answer either. He says, but that explanation would mean that the verses themselves are incomplete and lacking information. Like, bad read. Bad read, son. That's not going to work. I mean, you just literally just knocked down the two greatest Torah commentators of all time. But that's why he's the third greatest Torah commentator of all time. And here's his explanation, and it's a deep one. V'anachon be'enai. The correct interpretation in my eyes is that she said, if such a thing is happening to me, why am I in the world? I'd rather die or never have lived. Much like what Job said, would that I had never been. Wow. Okay, so again, Rashi says, oh my gosh, if pregnancy is so hard, why did I want to get pregnant? The Ibn Ezra says, she went and talked to other women. She said, oh, it's not so hard for you. Why is it so hard for me? The Ramban says, if this is what it's like, why do I even exist? Kill me now. Okay. What do you think? Like, is that fair? Is the Ramban, how did you like those dismissals? You have three interpretations there. Does one of those seem like the correct reading? And I guess in particular, could you read the verse that existentially? Some of you, I think, already basically were. But if this is what it's like, why do I exist? Can we try to unpack that a little bit? What's going on there? Now, I see hands up from before, so as usual, I'm calling on you, but not necessarily expecting you to jump right to this point. So, Esther, let's hear from you.
Okay, I actually did want to speak to this point. My first thought when I saw the quote in the text, Lama ze anochi, was, I'm sorry to be so modern and like crass, but FML, you know, like that was like my first thought. Like she's going.
Do you want to speak that out for the non-millennials among the bunch? I think I know what it is. But it's not very rabbinic, so go ahead and say it. F my life. Right?
My life.
F my
Fork
life.
is the word.
Fork. Thank you. Fork my life. You know, like fork this. But then I also went to another thought that connects to that with a little more depth. As you were unpacking the Nachmanides, it occurred to me, like minutes before that, if we look at Rivka in the way that you kind of cast her for us when you started this, as like this powerhouse figure, like not as like necessarily, oh, she female versus male, but just a pillar in our ancestors. Everyone gets tested in some way, right? And it's just this interesting process of a great person, you know, looking at like the archetype of the hero, comes in with gifts, with faith, like, wow, what a well-rounded character. And then all of a sudden there's this unexpected test that they never could have predicted. You know, we know the things we know the things we don't know. We're gonna do good in the world. And then there's the stuff we don't know. And it's like, is life playing a game with me? Is fate, is God hunking me now? Like for my life, like where did this come from? So I do see this kind of existential, and wow, the fact that Nachmanides brings in Job is so interesting. Because she's kind of like, she had so much faith as a young woman, just diving into this partnership and ready to have children, and everything is questioned now. And she's feeling it physically, literally. So I wouldn't be surprised if she had a moment. I know there's postpartum depression and, you know, whatever comes with that, but maybe even beforehand, she's just questioning everything. As Alexandra was kind of noting earlier, like, what does this say about me? What's the point of living? I put everything I can into this, and this is what happens. Just forget it. I'm out.
Good. I just saw Ellen I just realized that you had your hand up, and I see these little blue hands, so I missed it. But hi, would you like to add?
I just wanted to say, as somebody that had one very painful kicker that was a groin kicker, you wonder what kind of well, let the games begin. What kind of a personality is this? And it turns out, you know, it's an interesting journey with a child like that. It's because I had 3 kids, and that was the only one that was ouchies, you know? So, you know, you're in for something, you know? And the fact that she went to God, why not go to the top? I mean, come on, there's no one to ask. No woman has the same exact pregnancy as you.
Wow, love that. Thank you, Ellen. Wow, that's like Maisa Shahaya, like real world experience there. I so appreciate that. Yeah, go straight to the top. I love that. let's see. I'm gonna call on Julia, and before I do, I want to just say that Julia and I talked a little bit about this Parsha, and as we were talking, we noticed this other connection that I want to share with you, that I think because Esther was just giving us the kind of the existential, like, why is the Job like, why am I suffering like this? Like what? And I think that's right. I think part of what we're seeing, at least the Nachmanides, the Ramban trying to do here, I've already been trying to make the case that Rivka, Rebecca, was had a destiny and was marked as inheriting some kind of special, important blessing. But now we're beginning to read her as I just said, sort of a profound soul, an existential thinker, someone who's really asking questions like, why do I even exist? And there's an interesting connection here that we're just as an aside, and then I'll call on Julia. But since we discovered this together, that later on, when Jacob asks Esau to sell him his birthright, Esau says, I am at the point of death, so of what use is my birthright to me? But the language here is Vayomer Esav, Hine Anochi Holech Lamut. I'm going to die. V'lama ze li bechora. And why this for me an inheritance? And you'll see that's exactly the language that Rebecca uses. The Anochi lama ze, I, why this? And just a little while later, just verses later, her child Esau is using the same kind of language, which is interesting. Like, does he inherit from her a kind of like, what's like a certain kind of seriousness, depression, existential longing? That's also interesting, right? I'm just gonna die anyway. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but just to note it, because it deepens the case that Lama Zenochi is really like, why am I, right? Why am I at all? Julia.
Yeah, I think that especially given the answer that comes in the next verse, it's almost like she's not asking about the pain itself, but like what's going to be the point of all of this in the end. And like it becomes like this prophecy of like, this is going to be like her purpose in the world. And in some ways, like maybe I love that Nachmanides brought in Job and is saying like, why do I have to like live through this? But it's like, well, what's going to be like the bigger picture? And I think you were the one who pointed out when we were talking that like that in this sense, Rebecca's like very much a prophetess. And this is kind of like, in that way, her concern lies there. It's like, we don't have to worry about, well, maybe we do have to worry about the pain and the now, but like big picture, what are we looking at?
Okay, yeah, exactly right. And part of what Julia is doing so astutely here is to say that, well, wait a minute. We're spending all this time on the question, but to really understand this interchange and what it means for Rebecca and what she's asking in the seeking of God, we have to remember, Rebecca gets an answer. God speaks directly back to Rebecca, which is also wild. She just goes to seek God, and God's like, oh, well, here's the answer. And it's a prophecy. And we already saw her family giving her this like lofty blessing language, but the language that God gives her is it's epic, it's prophecy. Okay, so let's take a look at that in closing. But before we do, we got to get to my favorite, maybe this is definitely top 10 pieces of Torah that I've ever seen. And I like spoke about it once at Ikar. You like maybe have heard me blather on about this before, but this is the Kli Yakar. He is wrote in the 1600s in Prague. He's the chief rabbi of Prague. And I think he might be my favorite Torah commentator. There's something just so dynamic about his writing. Let me just say two things about it that will help you with this piece, which is that the midrashists, the rabbis, they were very kind of wild, creative interpreters of Torah. They would bend language and play with language and kind of seem to invent stories. Rashi kind of exposed us to that, but most of the other medieval commentators, it was the Middle Ages and it was scholasticism, and they got serious and things were supposed to be like very precise and just read the letters of the Torah and try to understand it without all this wild interpretive wordplay. And the Kli Yakar is a little bit of a return to Midrash. He's like, no, let's get wild again. Let's get wild again. But he's doing it in a different period, like a period that we might begin to call the Renaissance. And I say that because it does seem like he is aware of a kind of an individual's inner reflection. And we just saw that in Nachmanides. It's not like that doesn't exist, but there's a kind of speculation as to like the deeper meaning of everything that I think is distinct and I think anticipates, he is in some ways the forerunner of Hasidic interpretation. Okay, but so let's take a look at this piece. He's going to begin by reminding us of the midrash that we saw earlier with the two babies that run out of the stomach, okay? And then he just says the most remarkable thing. So let's take a look. The Kli Yakar said, and the children struggled in her room. This struggling, he says, happened when she would pass by the door of the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever. We learned that. Jacob struggled to come out, and Esav, in the Hebrew, grabbed his hand. And when she would pass by the door of idol worship, Esav struggled to come out, and Jacob grabbed his hand. Okay? That's what was, he said, the Kli Yakar is saying, that's what was happening inside of her. But as someone said earlier, who was it? Someone said, maybe it was Payam, maybe she didn't know. She didn't understand what was going on, and she didn't realize that it was twins. So this is what's happening, but it's not just she didn't realize it was twins. She's noticing that sometimes she walks by the house of God and a baby comes out or tries to come out. And sometimes she walks by the house, and let's just call it the devil, and the baby tries to get out, right? Like this. So listen to this. But she didn't reason out the matter this way. She didn't know what was going on, for she thought there was only one child who wanted to go into the doors of both Torah and idolatry. And therefore, she thought, have mercy, maybe there are two dominions. Maybe there are two gods. And so she asked, if so, why am I not acting like all the idolaters? Why am I like this? What do I gain by my faith if there really are, have mercy, two gods? Therefore, and then this is just, just the most precious Torah. Therefore, she went to seek God, which is to say, lidrosh achar mitziat Hashem mamash mahu. Therefore, she went to seek God, which is to say, she went to seek after the real nature of God's existence. What is God? If this is happening, if I see this one child is drawn to good and to evil, well, then there are two forces pulling at him, right? That means there are two powers in the world. I'm entering into this covenant that tells me there's one power in the world. It doesn't make sense. And must, do I have to speak out? It's another way of saying she sees good and evil in the world, and they are both mighty forces. And she struggles with, then there's no God, or there are two gods, or like, this doesn't make sense. And so she goes to figure out what God is. Okay. Oh my goodness. I just love that so much. I mean, just to think of, that's who Rebecca was. That's who she was. She was someone who was actually standing there in this tradition that she'd been she married into, and she's trying to figure out, wait, what is God? What is this? And I don't get it in this world where so many competing forces. I got to figure this out. And she went to figure it out. And God answered. And this is God's answer. God says, the Eternal answered her. Okay, cool. God just answered. 2 nations are in your womb. 2 different people shall emerge from your insides. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the greater shall serve the younger. V'yomer Hashem la, shnei goyim b'vidnech, u'shnei leumim mim'maich yiparedu, u'le'om mila'om yi'amatz v'rav yavod sa'ir. So we have to end soon, but what is this answer, right? She went to ask God something, and this is the answer she got. So what was she asking, and what is the response? What is her answer? What is her destiny? Let's turn to Ari.
It's all this is really amazing. So thanks for sharing. I'll just say, to take one step back, when I was reading this, I was reminded Walt Whitman has this great quote, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. And what strikes me is it's not the first time that brothers war in the Bible, right? There's Cain and Abel, there's Isaac and Ishmael in a sense, but they were different mothers in the case of Isaac and Ishmael, and the different pregnancies in the case of Cain and Abel, I believe, at least. Right, and here it's all contained within her, like literally within her womb. There is this, within one pregnancy, there is all this contradiction and but also all this creation, right? That the fact that she can, in one moment, in one pregnancy, in one body, encapsulate all this contradiction is really quite beautiful. And here it seems that God is sort of resolving it in a sense that, two different things, and one, the greater shall serve the younger. The younger always seems to be winning out here in the Hebrew tradition. But to me, what was striking about it was like, I could see why she could be confused by it, because she doesn't have a clear role. She has a contradictory role. She in a way, she's like her own Garden of Eden, right? She contains this, seed that is contradictory.
Multitudes,
really
right?
Amazing. Multitudes, quite literally.
Alfei Rabava, yeah. That is so. I love that reading. All right, you've taken a lot of what we've just seen, but flipped it a little bit so that, and I think this is right. That yes, she's wondering about the two children inside of her, but that means they're both a part of her. So following this reading, but really she's asking, why do I have good and bad inside of me? I have creative potential, and I also have destructive force. I am complicated. I'm all mixed up. I'm not, like, I'm composed of all these things. I'm drawn to good and to evil. So what's the force? What's the force in the world? How do I live my life? Right? A deep question about the nature of me. Okay, I think we have time for one more comment. Rachel?
Yeah, so one, I just think it's interesting. Like, I think it's important that they talk about her pregnancy, just period, in a book written by men, because
by God, by the way, but never mind.
Pardon? Well, like, who was deciding what got actually compiled?
Totally. Yes,
like,
agreed.
It's like, people used to hide pregnancy in movies, not the way we do now, because it doesn't like match the character, but because it was like, women can't be pregnant, post-pregnancy bodies. Like, we don't talk about birth a lot even now, or the difficulty of birth. And birth was really, really dangerous. And it's still way too dangerous in this country for women of color. So I just think it's worth noting that, like, I think it's cool that we talk about the actual difficulty. But separate from that, I think she is asking a very existential question. Like, I think it's totally would be legitimate to pray to God, like, why are you giving me morning sickness? But then I don't necessarily know that it would be in the Torah, and I don't know that God would reply to that. So I think the fact that God replies does tell us it's this essential question, and it's the essential question we see in so many traditions. It was, I think, Sophocles that said, is the greatest boon to have not been born at all. Like, if I'm going to suffer, then why am I here? And what I get the echo back to is, am I my brother's keeper? Like, the entire lesson potentially of the Torah. And there's two brothers in her womb, and to me it reflects on the way Buber sees God, I think, which is in our relationship with each other. That's where the divine is, and that's really all we can potentially know on earth, is how do we treat other people? And so I sort of see that in there, like, there isn't an answer, but there is a relationship in which we are in the world. It can be with ourselves, in our what we lean to when we're
right.
And
Right.
yeah, so I see a prophecy that can be broken. I know that's really strange, but I see it as like, this could go either way, and everyone is making little behind the scenes decisions to change it. And I think it's also saying, like, we're not beholden to our birthright of good or evil, that we have these choices, and in our relationships with others, we get to make them.
Okay.
That was a lot in one.
Yeah, that was a lot, and you placed us in a kind of a philosophical tradition there, and so that's a lot in the grand sense. And I want to end maybe picking up on what Rachel just said by placing Rebecca perhaps in a philosophical tradition. That is, Rebecca isn't just the inheritor of the Abrahamic mantle, she is distinct. There's something about Rebecca that she's going to add something to this tradition. She's the second generation, she's the shaper of the second, and just like Jacob will be different from his mother and his grandfather, Rebecca's different. And some of that is her power and her power as a woman. She's associated Kabbalistically with the force of Gevura, power. But some of that, I think we might say, given what we've looked at today, is that she is the beginning of a different kind of relationship to God. Abraham is just like, yeah, whatever, I'll sacrifice my son. Right? She's like, what's going on here? And she is the progenitor then to, well, maybe Moses in a certain way, but maybe Job, right? Nachmanides suggests, and maybe medieval theologians, maybe all of us who wonder about why there is good and evil in the world and what is the nature of God. I want to know that. That's quite a legacy. And I think I'll just end by, right, we've been looking at all the hints of Rachel's greatness, but let's just make a big final punctuation mark by reading the passage in which Rebecca indeed actively, deviously, powerfully shapes the fate of the Jewish people. And that is in the birthright scene, where we always, again, patriarchal tradition, talk about Jacob stealing the birthright. This wasn't Jacob's plan, not by a long shot. Rebecca said to her son Jacob, I overheard your father speaking to your brother Esau, saying, bring me some game and prepare a dish for me to eat, that I may bless you with the Eternal's approval before I die. Well, Rebecca knows about blessings. She inherited one, and she knows where the blessings are going. She's got a prophecy in her mind, a prophecy she got from God directly. So now, my son, listen carefully as I instruct you. Go to the flock and fetch me 2 choice kids, and I will make of them a dish for your father, such as he likes. Then take it to your father to eat, in order that he may bless you before he dies. Rebecca's idea. Jacob answered, now listen to this. Here's the real punctuation. Jacob answered his mother Rebecca, but my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I'm smooth-skinned. If my father touches me, I shall appear to him as a trickster. I'm going to get caught and bring upon myself a curse, not a blessing. Who's he worried about? Himself. Bring upon myself a curse, not a blessing. But his mother said to him, your curse, my son, be upon me. Just do as I say and go and fetch them for me. And that's it. That's Jacob's fate. That's the next generation. Rebecca decides, now that I'm mentioning Jacob, I'm thinking Rachel. Rebecca decides who the next generation is going to be, not Isaac. Right? And she does so with prophecy ringing in her ears. Matriarchy begins. So we'll leave it there. I'll stay on if people want to ask more questions. But thanks for joining me, everybody. Really wonderful learning today. Yeah, Elle, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
I just have one question about why she asked him to get 2 kids. Certainly, he didn't need 2 goats to prepare a meal. Did that have something to do with
that's an interesting question, but it ends up being the best answer comes in the book of Leviticus, when the 2 goats that we use on Yom Kippur are a kind of an allusion to this. So this is what to think about there. Clearly, the simpler answer is the 2 goats are clearly meant to signal to the 2 possibilities of blessing here. Other questions? Any other questions? Alexandra?
I have a question that's sort of going back towards the beginning of class. Last week we learned about a moment when Yitzchak prays and he's in the field, and then she sees him, falls off the camel, but he then finds comfort in his wife, and it seemed to me like, in contrast to the prayer, like he wasn't finding comfort in the prayer or an answer in his prayers. And then after being married to Rebecca, he prays and then gets an answer in his prayers. And I'm wondering, are there other instances before then, or maybe even after, but more relevant, I think, before then, of him praying and his specific connection to God? Or are those
I think the answer is that you're tracing it quite nicely. That's true. Isaac seems to be deep in prayer. Isaac's no slouch. I mean, he's got an intense personal spiritual life, but right, Rebecca seems to represent something else, and I like the way you're framing it. It's almost like she comes to respond to his prayer. And again, here, I never really noticed that. He's praying, she does something. He's praying, she does something. Actually, let's just take a look at that scene for a second, because I almost included it today, but I just think it's really, if you're beginning to draw a whole picture of Rebecca, raising her eyes, Rebecca saw Isaac. She alighted from the camel as she fell off, or she dropped down, let's say, from the camel. And she said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field towards us?" And the servant said, "That is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. Now, that's an interesting moment, because on the one hand, took her veil and covered herself, very kind of ancient feminine image. But on the other hand, it's so striking that as they meet, the active figure is, who's that? Like this really girl coming into and she's like, "Tell me who that is." Like, you can feel like she's already in charge of the servant. Like, it's her servant already. Like, it's something, there's streaks of power even there. Yeah, David Kurtz.
So, hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the second time in a short period of time where a woman is barren, speaks to God, God promises conception, and there doesn't seem to be, necessarily Abraham doesn't necessarily need to be there, and maybe Isaac doesn't. It has a really strange resonance for me of maybe God was a little more in there.
Holy Mary, Mother of God. What are you saying?
Exactly. And, and they both, and Sarah has a whole conversation with God, and here Rebecca's having a whole conversation. Why didn't she go to her husband and say, "God, what's going on inside of me?" Not to God, Isaac, what's going on inside, just to God.
Yeah.
And, I haven't formed an idea here, but there's an interesting relationship with God.
There is an interesting relationship. I mean, that's so massive what you're saying. It's so explosive, but there really is interesting work to be done there. I mean, this theme that David is sort of politely alluding to, that is really borne out in Christianity, obviously, that there could be a kind of an intimate relationship between a woman who will birth a child and really God, who will be the parent, right? And Christians didn't get that from nowhere. That's present. You're seeing traces of it here. It's an interesting thing, but it's really prominent in the book of Judges, in the story of Samson, Eshet Manoach. If you read that story, go read the story of Samson, and you'll see how like the mother of Samson is always called the wife of Manoach. She's not even given a name, and yet like Manoach he's just a loser. Like, he's just like trying to figure out what's going on. It's really the angel of God that seems to be the father of the child. So take a look at that. It's also true with Hannah, who prays for a child, and like seems like it's kind of the priest God that she's really in a relationship with, right? And then all of that becomes this sort of strange template for a metaphor where we are the woman, the nation of Israel, and God is the man. And we're in this, Hosea, think of Hosea, where we're in this relationship where we're going to birth God's truth into the world. Kind of just wild stuff, but that requires a whole dissertation, right? Yeah. Randy. Hey, Randy.
Hey, Rabbi, I had a quick question about I was struck by the fact that God actually is talking directly to Rebecca. And I remember God talking directly to Eve. And I remember God talking directly to Rebecca. I don't remember God talking directly to Sarah. And I'm trying to remember if God speaks directly to any other woman in the rest of the Torah.
Yeah.
Does Hashem speak with Miriam directly? I don't remember that.
Miriam is called a prophet, but it's not clear that God is ever speaking to Miriam directly. Sarah is called a prophet. It's also not clear that God ever speaks to Sarah directly, though Sarah seems to be in dialogue. She hears God. Sarah's certainly a prophet in the sense she hears God and laughs at what God says.
Right, but here we get God's direct quote.
Yeah,
which I think is so interesting. Hagar.
No, it's first the angel, but then I believe the words change, so it appears as if then God switches to talking to Hagar from the way.
Hagar is talking, right, correct. God talks directly to Hagar. God talks directly to Eve. So this is not the only woman God talks to.
I'm just wondering if this is the last woman that God talks to. That was going to be my point.
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a really good question. Let me think about that. I think that's true, at least as far as the Torah is concerned.
And I wanted to say something else.
Yeah.
I love the fact that you gave us generations as another gloss of toldot, that it doesn't really just mean story. There's an actual word for that. And I think that's important to understand this whole chapter, I guess I would say. I mean, just because generations and these lists of children and generations is so important in the Torah, and frankly, irritating, right? We're right in the middle of a narrative, and then suddenly we get generation by generation,
right.
all these family trees. So thank you. I just,
right.
For me, that really says something about the way this story is told. It's not simply a story. It's
I've heard this exact, it's a great point, Randy. And let me just add to that. I've heard this exact point made by Hannah Jensen, who I'll call on next. She says that, the list of the begats, this guy begat this guy begat this guy. And it's like, as Hannah said, it's infuriating. It's like, you have all these generations of men giving birth to men. Like what? Like what? If ever you're going to mention a woman, when you're telling the story of the generations of who produced who, right? So maybe we have to close soon, but let's end with Hannah Jensen.
I did not expect that shout out. Thank you. Wow. It does make me very angry. But what David Kurtz said earlier, are you still here? Okay, you're still here. Good. Reminded me of, I was thinking about last week's class when we were discussing Chaya Sarah and Jacob taking comfort with Rebecca, and how that for him helped him deal with his mother and understanding her grief and the connection between those two women. And after that comment earlier, I started to think about maybe part of what he saw in Rebecca in that initial kind of moment was this very strange early, maybe pre-conscious understanding of being born from a woman who was barren, who then God made able essentially to have a baby, whose father was vaguely not involved in that. And then he came into the world and he sees this woman, and somehow, and this goes back to my sort of mystical understanding of all of it, but that he had some feeling of, she is a mirror to that experience of my mother. And I came into the world this way, and I am going to partner with someone who's going to bring other people into the world this way. That there's some mirroring that is even more than what I was thinking about before. So I'm just wondering about those kinds of conception stories as also being part of how they're aligned.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great note to close on, I think, because we've spoken so much about gender roles and gendered power. And I've been trying to make the case that Rebecca is exceptional because she's the powerful figure in this generation. But I think it's worth, I'm just going to sort of borrow from the echo you're seeing there, or maybe that Isaac's seeing there, and say that it's worth remembering Sarah was no slouch, right? Sarah also controlled who would be the inheritor in the generation. And Sarah had a lot of power in that relationship. And God acknowledges that. I don't know that God speaks to Sarah directly, but God says to Abraham, do as Sarah says. Listen to the voice of your wife, Sarah. that's already pretty significant when we think about matriarchs. Sarah very much was a matriarch. My point in this class, though, was that Rebecca isn't just the matriarch of that generation. She's the head of that generation. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody.